great person. You're a great person. And we're all going to be great people, because that is what is going to happen to us one day. So let's go back to Ephesians. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love he predestined us to be adopted as sons. I never used to like that, to be adopted as sons. Why do you say adopted? I'm sure it's much better to be straight sons. Why to be adopted? Seems a lower second class to me. But it wasn't. It wasn't. Under the Greek or Roman law of that time, you could disinherit a natural son. You could not disinherit an adopted son. You couldn't do it. So to be an adopted son, you're in a more secure position than if you were a natural son. You cannot lose your salvation. You cannot lose your inheritance. You cannot lose these things that he's writing about because you're adopted children. The wills were written and they were put in a public place, and you could not change your will. And so if you adopted a child, he was entitled to his inheritance no matter what he was like. And that was it. And that was it. In love he predestined us to be adopted as his sons through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure. It's God's pleasure to do these things for us. It's God's pleased to do it. It's a pleasure for him to do it. You know, and I think we've had a tough time as parents, difficult times, difficult children, but I have learned so much. It's a pleasure for me to do things for my children. I'm not surprised that God finds it a pleasure to do things to me. I'm not being arrogant here. You know, I hope you don't think I am. But it's a pleasure for God to do things for you. Because he is your father. And fathers have pleasure in doing things for their children. You know, I was brought up in the valleys of Wales with a very strong Protestant working class ethics. My job was to work hard at school, get a good job, so I could provide for my wife and my children. That was my role in society. Still a role, still my main role, as far as I can see it. And still have that attitude. And sociologically, young males in Britain have big problems. They have no role. They have no role. So they binge drink. They pick up girls and drop them. They're becoming like bulls. Hedonistic, animalistic. Because they have no role. There is nothing clearly defined in society for them to do. It was, for me, clearly defined, and I'm glad it was clearly defined. And it's a pleasure to do things for my wife. It's a pleasure to do things for my children. It's a pleasure to do things for people you love. And God loves us, and we're his children. So that is what he do, because he has done it according to his pleasure and his will. No wonder Paul says, to the praise of his glorious grace. Not just praise to his grace, but praise to his glorious grace. Because all this is by grace. I don't have to do a thing for it. Grace. Many years ago, some Buddhist monks in Japan. I don't know a lot about Buddhism, so I'm not quite certain how you get from one level to the next level or what you have to do. But they have various rituals like buying pigeons and letting them loose so they fly back to the temple, or buying fish and putting them in a stream so they swim back to the temple pool, and various things like this. There's empty ritual in all sort of religions, including Christian religion. And these Buddhist monks actually came to the conclusion that there was only one way in which they could gain the next stage, and that was by grace. But it never caught on because they could never understand how grace could work. How does grace work? God can be gracious because Christ has paid the punishment. Christ has taken the punishment. He's paid the penalty, therefore he can be gracious. God is the just and the justifier. God is a righteous God. He can't just say to you, oh, well, forget about those things you did wrong. God is austere. He set up a very rigid law. You sin, you die. All Adam did was take a bite of a fruit, for goodness sake. Well, it's no great, traumatic, terrible thing that he did. That's what Eve did, you know. What's wrong with that? Why this death sentence? Because that's what I said. The two faces of God, the stern face of God, the righteous judge. And then the smiling face of God as the one who came in the person of Jesus Christ to pay that penalty. So he's the just God and he's the justifier God. He's done it himself. He made the harsh law, he paid the harsh price. And you may think, and I may think, about the terrible physical pain that Christ went through on the cross. There's been that film made a couple of years ago, The Passion. I didn't see it, I didn't particularly want to see it. Because to me, everything I read about it showed that it dwelt on the physical suffering of Christ. The beatings, the crown of thorns on his head, the crucifixion. I don't want to belittle the physical pain that Christ went through. I would never want to go through 1% of that, sorry. I've been a very privileged person, lived in a very privileged society. I have never been subject to any great physical torture or pain or anything like that. It horrifies me, the thought does. But whatever Christ went through physically was nothing compared to what he went through spiritually. When he who knew no sin became sin. He became sin. And that's why the Father, so to speak, turned his back on the Son. And the Son shouted out, my God, why have you forsaken me? There was a rift, if I could speak like this, in the Godhead. Goodness knows. I can't understand. I do not know. It is above comprehension. But that is what he did. For you and for me and for all mankind. And all those who believe in him will enjoy the benefits of it. No wonder Paul talks about his glorious grace. His glorious grace, which he has freely given. You see, Ephesians is one of these words, one of these epistles that keeps having all these adjectives and adverbs, qualifying things. It's not just grace, it's glorious grace. It's not just what he's given, it's freely given. God hasn't begrudged us this grace, you know. It's freely given. It's freely given. In him we have redemption through his blood. I remember years ago when I was in teaching, the English teacher came up to me and said, Mike, I said, yeah, Eddie? You Christians are not doing a very good job. I said, why, Eddie? He's a lax Catholic himself. I said, why, Eddie? He says, well, I'm going through some Shakespeare, yeah, and they don't understand any of the biblical symbolisms, and today I had to try and explain grace to them. Sad. Today I have to try and explain grace to them. Redemption is another thing that people are having difficulty understanding. Grace and redemption. I remember some years ago, we have a radio program, well, lots of radio programs, and there's this one in the morning, at 10 to 8 in the morning, they have fought for the day. It's totally controlled by liberals now. You have liberal Christians, liberal Jews, liberal Muslims, liberal Hindus, liberal Sikhs, they're all liberals. So they all say exactly the same thing. This person, this was probably 30 years ago, said, today I want to talk about God's grace. Ooh, I thought this was good. Sat down with my cup of coffee, and her definition of God's grace was this. As long as we did one kind act in life, God would be gracious and let us into heaven. That was her definition of grace. What she said indeed was a definition of grace. I can't gainsay that. That was a definition of grace. And if that is the criteria in which God would accept people into heaven, saying all you have to do in your life is one kind act, that indeed would be gracious. I cannot deny that. But that's not the grace that the Bible talks about. We are saved by grace through faith, not of works. So no one can boast. My kind act was better than your kind act. Sorry, you can't boast. You can't boast. No. The Catholics have lots of means of grace.